Nation. So we have a really cool person here today. He's a writer, an author, a futurist, an activist. He's a whole bunch of stuff. He's done work for a technology advisor. She's done work on short films, television. Is an ambassador in an AI company called Persona and robotics company called Body AI. He's an editor of social media manager of Serious Wonder, affiliate scholar for the Institute of Ethics and Emerging Technologies. He's a co-author of both Future of Business, Critical Insights into a Rapidly Changing World from 60 Futures Thinkers and 50/50 Scenarios for the Next 50 Years. I mean, that's an exciting resume. BJ Murphy, welcome to Nation.
Pleasure to be here.
Absolutely, thank you. Well, tell us, how did you get involved in AI? Is everybody else seems to like science fiction, and then suddenly they're involved with the future and all that. Is that your story, or is it more of a different story? You woke up one day and something happened.
Well, before I ever got really into just science and tech in general, I was a factory worker, just, down here in the South, and almost died in a factory because just a crazy ass mishap. But that was like a big turning point for me. I was dealing with my mother. She was fighting cancer at the time. She ended up passing away in 2013. And it was that year that when that mishap happened, it was just one of those situations where everything clicked that life is way too short for me to be doing things that I have no interest in me or my personal endeavors. So I started writing, started pursuing a career of writing, a lot of it pro bono work just to see how people take me. And it was within science and tech, and I started getting more involved within the topics of artificial intelligence, robotics, gene editing, you name it. And from there, it just sort of picked up, and I've been doing it ever since.
Yeah, so it was a dramatic life event that brought you over. It wasn't just this sort of gradual process of liking, reading science fiction and then, sort of.
I've always had a love for it. Like as a kid, when I was little, my parents would always take me to like whenever they go grocery shopping, and you know how like back then kids would typically go through like video game magazines. Some of them would even steal those little demo discs that were in the back of those magazines. For me, I was stealing science magazines. There's no way that they were going to give me a science magazine or that was like $30. So I just grabbed those. I stole for science as a kid. I don't condone it, but that was where my mindset was. So
Uh,
I've
that
always had a love and interest for it.
that's interesting. Yes, yeah. Don't condone it. We don't condone stealing, but it's interesting nonetheless. So similar to Zoltan, it's fun in the way that he almost stepped on a landmine, which almost killed him, changed his life. He realized the fragility of life, and he comes to advocating for life through technology. Sort of similar with you. You have a traumatic incident in a factory, and it almost kills you or whatever, and then you suddenly realize the fragility, and you want to do things along the line of enhancing future outcomes through technology.
Right.
All right, cool. And what about all this? So, what about all this other stuff? You Serious Wonder, AI ambassador. I mean, how did you fumble? How did you get involved with these? Did you write up a resume and you just hand them out, or did you build an online profile, or how did you end up writing future business stuff? And how did you get on these big platforms?
It was a bit of everything. Like I said, I started just writing pro bono, just to see how people would take me, and I would just keep writing and writing, and just started building up a resume. And I eventually started throwing it around over to like IEET, the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies. They enjoyed what I was writing about, so they brought me on. And over time, that eventually became where they brought me in as a scholar for them. And from there, I ended up meeting Grace Scott and Kevin Russell of Serious Wonder, and they really enjoyed my work. And they asked me if I wanted to tag along, and I said yes, and I've been working for them ever since. And it's just sort of been that process of just keep writing, keep pumping out content, building up contacts, through like-minded individuals and just seeing where it takes me. And
Uh,
it's so far been pretty beneficial.
Yeah, that's good. It's an exciting journey when you can build your own life and dictate your own life in your own way based on what you want to do. I think that's an admirable trait, and because it's always unknown. If you just choose the 9 to 5, the safe path, that Yoda
Yeah,
warns
yeah,
against, you're gonna it's all too generic. It's all too boring. It's all too baby fed, baby spooned. But when you go out on a limb, sometimes it pays off, sometimes it doesn't, sometimes it takes a while. But when you can actually flow through and engage with your passion in a way that you've done, I highly commend that. And you've become the director of social media for the U.S. Transhumanist Party. How's that job? How are you finding that?
uh, it's really fun. It's also really complicated at times. It's I've been in politics longer than I have in science and tech, and it's sort of weird because it's like both of my worlds. Because I got involved in politics when I was like 12 years old, uh, and then I eventually transitioned to science and tech as a sort of I need to back up and start considering my own life at this moment. And now those worlds are sort of colliding, and it's kind of a trip. Like I'm seeing a lot of things that I've been used to over the years, and other things where we're talking about brand new topics that are going to transform society, and trying to deal with people from that standpoint is a bit more different. It's a bit more different dealing with activists than from a political standpoint, and then activists who want to transform the human condition in itself. So it's been a trip, but I enjoy it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So you're an ethicist, and something that's on the radar of the ethics community, especially in the bio world. Uh, this is a bit of clickbait, but China, with their genetic genome genetic enhancements and their ambitions in the genetics world, there's been some talk of human hybrid monkeys coming out of China. You've been following this for a long time, especially over the longevity of like over the years. What is it? What's going on with that? Is it because they have no regulations? Is it because they don't care? Is it because it's the next step in humanity? Is it because it's science? What's going on there? And what's the sort of technical slash ethical considerations of human monkey hybrids and chimeras, etc.?
Well, the chimeras, yeah, first and foremost, yeah, the hype tends to revolve around the idea that they are creating these Stephen King type dystopian human, half monkey, half human type hybrids. And the fact of the matter is, really, it's just introducing certain DNA into non-viable embryos, which usually just means they're not going to be brought in to full term. They're not going to be fully alive. This is just a test to see how certain DNA splicing of one form of DNA from a different animal to crossbreed over into a human, and see what the effects would be. See if there would be any type of medical applications. See if there be any way of addressing certain conditions that we humans suffer from, or even of other animals. But right now that's sort of revolving around a hype stage. We don't really know what's going to what's going to come as a result of these chimera trials, or if anything will ever really come from it. But the media certainly loves eating it up. But really, there's just a lot more going on within the world of genetics and gene editing, from China even to here in the United States. In fact, the U.S. To this day still holds more CRISPR-related patent applications than China. The United States has about 872, whereas China has about 858, which is significant considering that Europe has somewhere over 180 CRISPR-related patent applications by comparison to the 800s within the United States and China. So it's not that they're not taking it seriously. I think China and the United States are the two countries that are probably taking it most seriously, because they recognize.
Europe, not having as many patents as say the USA and China, 170 versus 800 and something, comparatively, and this is interesting because you're talking about a new Cold War between two different superpowers, and the superpowers are competing on this gene editing CRISPR related idea that these are where this is where technology and the future is. So this is where the battleground. This is the modern battleground space. It's in this patent space. It's in this CRISPR patent space, and it shows you how depleted Europe is as compared to these two vying superpowers of China and the United States in this space, showing that they're at 700 deficit on the. It just shows you relatively how far behind Europe is, how much Europe has declined since, say, it's zenith, pre World War One, and its eventual decline after World War Two, even though they had a little bit of a rebound with the British Empire and the Russian Empire, arguably in between the wars of World War One and World War Two. But so this is part of the new modern battle spaces. These patents in this CRISPR technology. Hopefully your internet is back now.
But yeah, everything seems fine on my end.
Yep, you're back. I can hear you. Yep. So so you were talking about CRISPR patents, China.
Just saying that it's not that China doesn't take anything, not taking the whole gene editing sphere seriously. I believe that they take it very seriously, as does the United States, because they realize how transformational it is, and they're going to try and do everything they can to be ahead of this curve. And we already saw with that one Chinese scientist that ended up going far beyond what the scientific community would accept, even China's scientific community, when he allowed the full-term birth of somebody that got modified using gene editing technologies. And the Chinese government wasn't happy, the United States government wasn't happy, the scientific community wasn't happy. So I think there really shouldn't be that much worry coming from either spheres, so long the scientific community remains at the helm of this sort of genetics revolution that's taken place. So long they're able to do the work and be able to abide by the ethical guidelines that are being laid forth through whichever agency that they respond to. I believe that it's going to be quite beneficial for humanity.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of this gene editing, gene editing in a way, crossbreeding at least, has been commonplace in agriculture in the plants world forever. Fish as well to a smaller extent, but forever, right? So is this just taking biology just that one step? It's just changing up the type of biology. And it's not really a big deal, or do you see, because of the idea of consciousness and sentience, is there ethical implications there?
Well, there are certain ethical implications that will arise from human gene editing that we wouldn't otherwise find ourselves involved in when it comes to plants or any type of agriculture. But it is still, nonetheless, just the next step within the genetics revolution, that, as you know, with agriculture, it's already generated its own form of controversy. There are a lot of people within the anti-GMO movement, despite the fact that we've already acquired scientific consensus among a broad swath of scientists all across the world that say gene editing crops is not going to be harmful to the environment. It's not going to be harmful to human consumption. But there's still that controversy that surrounds the whole topic. And with human gene editing, we're going to have to sort of walk on a thinner rope here, because that then involves us more directly. And so even if it's going to be it's going to be beneficial for everybody, even if we take every ethical and moral safety precaution that is possible, there's still going to be controversy that generates from it. There are going to be a lot of people that more than likely not be so forthcoming about wanting their, say, child, or even before that child was born, to be modified, even if it is a modification that would, say, eliminate the potential for cancer or diabetes or something along those lines.
Yeah. You start to get into the realm of playing God at this point, where the religious folk will speak up and they will say, "Oh, you guys are playing God. You're messing with God's creation, God's design, God's purpose with this gene editing stuff." And you get the biologists who. We're having Ben Zion join us now. He's been off gallivanting around again, doing important things with his campaign. So welcome, Ben. We're talking AI ethics. We're talking gene editing. We're talking AI ethics. How are you, Ben?
Feeling pretty good. Good to see you, BJ. Thanks, Steele.
Likewise.
So Ben, you've joined us in on the conversation. So we were talking about the implications of CRISPR in terms of plant.
The context, I didn't quite get that context.
BJ, if you'd like to take over the conversation.
We're just discussing the sort of the implications and the differences between the gene editing of agriculture by comparison to that of the gene editing of humans, which is a more recent development.
And we've kind of had these conversations along regulatory lines a few times on this show, and I think people who are very techno-progressive might tend to have one view as it relates to GMOs and another as it relates to human upgrades.
Yeah.
And there's an awful lot of variation therein. So are there any genetically modified organisms outside of some kind of a death microbe that you have hesitations about, BJ?
I have no hesitations with the gene editing. I feel like that there are always going to be those controversies, and this is what we're talking about briefly. With the controversies that surround the agriculture sector, gene editing, the anti-GMO movement, that it doesn't really matter whether we take every ethical and moral safety precaution in regards to human gene editing in the same way that we did with the genetic modifications of organisms and use it within agriculture. There's still going to be people that are going to be a bit more hesitant towards those applications, especially in regards to humans, since it's going to be a lot more direct. It's going to affect us a lot more. There's going to be a much more big of an impact on us as a species, as opposed to a species of plant.
And this area where the most headway has been made towards fully engineering organisms is also the area where much of the existential risk might derive. So the thing that we're able to do best is at this point one of the most dangerous things you could possibly do. So like any number of grad students that you or I know could conceivably, if they lost their minds, create a very, very dangerous organism very easily. So to that end, we've talked about the need for a surveillance state, a surveillance mechanism, as opposed to the surveillance state, to kind of make sure that nobody stumbles into some person carrying a huge grudge doesn't create something that does great damage to ecosystems or human beings. Where are you? I think that you are somebody who's definitely pretty, at least as much of an anarcho-syndicalist as I am. How do you see something like a surveillance state unfolding?
We already have a surveillance state to a large degree. The question is how do people address it? Do we continue allowing it to run as is? Do we try to eliminate all surveillance? In my opinion, that is one option that we've already gone past the point of no return. We've already transformed the surveillance state to a self-surveillance state to a large degree, because most people, they don't mind. Right. And for a lot of people, with their use of apps on their phones and whatever, they know that they're being recorded. They know that their data is being used, and a lot of them are fine with it. They have no issues with it. The problem, though, is to try and ensure that their data isn't being used nefariously, and that also includes other technologies not being used nefariously. And that's when the surveillance state, or the concept of a surveillance state, would be beneficial for everybody, because it allows us, it's basically open sourcing the surveillance state. It's allowing people to have an equal say, an equal boundary of political power using surveillance as a means of pretty much keeping everybody in check. We won't do anything nefarious on your end so long. Over here, nobody's doing anything nefarious as well. And it seems to be a much more beneficial system than what we have today under the surveillance state.
Will surveillance eventually, in a famous movie, Gattaca, sci-fi film in the 90s, surveillance basically moves into the genome system. It's basically a dystopian film about where your genes and your parents' DNA and everything regulates who you are, what job you get, what positions you get in society. So essentially, surveillance goes from being cameras in the street that everyone thinks about to actually dictating their life from the inside out. BJ, do you see that happening, or do you think that's just dystopian fantasy?
I don't think it's dystopian fantasy, but we're putting cameras in our bodies already by, we have the cameras that are connected to little sensor pills that doctors use to traverse through the body to see where they need to make a certain surgery, or to they have some sensors to maintain to see if a patient is keeping up with their medications as prescribed by the doctor, aren't abusing it, aren't not using it. I think that's going to be, I don't think it's going to turn into a dystopian nightmare, but the idea of being able to peer into the human body in the same way that we're able to peer inside of a building today using cameras or any type of sensors for that matter, while there are going to be certain ethical guidelines that these new technologies are going to have to abide by, new regulations, it's going to be transformational in the way that we address human disease, the way that we address certain issues in the human body that we would have otherwise have no idea what was going on in the human patient, because right now there's such a large disconnect between patients and their doctors that for a lot of people, especially people that are dealing with things like chronic illnesses, the doctors aren't really able to do all that much for the patients. And so if we're able to actually peer into the human body and get a better understanding of what's going on, that should be accepted. That's something that everyone should be rooting for. Just because there may be some bumps along the way, some bumps in the road in terms of ethics or morals or regulations, that shouldn't stop us from pursuing it. We just have to continue having this conversation and have this conversation with politicians as well, and with the ethics committees, and start building an actual functional framework that ensures that these technologies come to fruition, all the while addressing whatever risk that may arise.
Then Zion, you've got your Futurist New Deal platform. Before we were talking about human-monkey hybrids. Does your Futurist New Deal or your candidacy talk about the ethics of CRISPR, the ethics of gene editing? Do you think that there should be laws in place, etc., and ethical considerations for these, or do you want to just libertarian? Do you just want anarchy on the stage of allowing these technologies to progress unabated?
Well, you can't have everything progress unabated. For one thing, what we were just talking about of just somebody making a bacteria that that deconstructs the ocean. It's gray goo scenarios. It's not that hard to envision how those could take place. Not that they're high probability events. So there's also effects like that in transgenic organisms of a higher order, so to speak. But effects that would be more destabilizing to the civil society at large. We can't exactly predict what those are, but we could certainly make a list. And some of those things would be things that really freak people out. Even the biobags, the artificial wombs is potentially one of those things. I don't regard that as dangerous in itself, but if it creates a staunch bioluddite resistance, then it's not a great thing that I want to see. And I don't know what the probabilities are that are quite low, but we could list all manner of things of this kind. So yeah, we can't just go. But no, there's not an awful lot of regulation of those things that I think needs to be done. There's only the things that basically relate to public safety and relate to standards and practices a little bit beyond that, but that's kind of an open question.
BJ, do you think the political infrastructure, the regulatory infrastructure, there's enough around CRISPR gene editing and the likes? Do you think there's enough, or do you think that there's too much and it's hampering progress in the area in any way?
That's a bit of a difficult question, because where on the one hand you have over in California, you have this bill that was being introduced where they're trying to address human gene editing from the CRISPR DIY kits that people like biohackers like Josiah Zahner are selling online, that go from anywhere from like $20 to like $1,000 something. And honestly, it isn't so much about whether their attempts to regulate a growing emerging technology. That isn't the issue. There should be regulations in place, and as the technology grows, we should have regulations which are set in place that address these new conditions. It's in the way that we're going about it that's going to matter the most, and how we address these technologies. And that's going to largely come from a better understanding of these technologies. If the government wants to come in and try to ensure that no deadly event, no unfortunate situation occurs as a result of gene editing, then we're going to have to be able to ensure that our politicians, those that are setting up, are aware of what these technologies do, how they affect us as a species, and how it may affect society. And I think also all I'm really asking for is for increased education on emerging technologies by our government, because they are going to regulate it, and to ensure that the regulations are proper and not going to be detrimental to us, that it's going to require a little bit of education.
Yeah, so Ben, you jumped in a little bit. You've jumped in the middle of the conversation, which is awesome. So just I want to give you a little bit of time to speak on anything you want to speak on CRISPR, gene editing, artificial wombs. You mentioned that. Go ahead, because I want to segue over into some of these other techs, including AI, while we have an ethicist here, because I think that'll be very interesting. So if you've got anything to say on genetics, human hybrid chimeras, the ethics of any of this stuff, go ahead.
Well, I could say an awful lot about artificial wombs, or lions and tigers and bears, oh my. But the Futurist New Deal is essentially a reform ticket that is oriented towards setting the stage for radical life extension. And there's a lot of things that we could be doing in these areas that would advance that from a regulatory perspective. You know, I spoke to Estonian emissary Florian Marcus. You guys can check out that podcast. A lot of interesting discussion of e-governance there. But we also at the end talked a lot about the use of data science in their public health service, an area that has grown almost to the point where they are on verge of being able to have a public health breakthrough wherein they're able to add an awful lot of prevention and early interventions and constant oversight to this system, setting the stage for a much less expensive public health service that could conceivably provide longevity to all of their citizens. That's a nice thing. And that's the main thing that I want to see happening from the life sciences. There's an awful lot of other wonderful thought experiments that we could engage. But some of that stuff, we just have to play it as it lands.
BJ, anything else you want to add as an ethicist and as a writer and a thinker on these subjects?
Just that, as transhumanists, for a lot of us, we adhere to what is known as the fractionary principle, and that being that with these technologies, since we're increasingly becoming a multipolar world, which.
All right, so you can still hear me,
okay,
right?
You're back now. Yeah, we could hear each other. We couldn't hear you, but BJ's ready here.
Yeah. The precautionary the principle is a very good one. It's a very good principle, based on this multipolar exercise of the fact that there's competition in these arenas, and
well, it's in the idea that that these transformations, regardless of what our opinions may be on the matter, so we're going to have to start operating from a different standpoint, a different viewpoint, and that being where it accommodates the multipolar world that we live in. And that is, we have to continue moving forward technologically, scientifically, but we should still have that conversation. We should have a more broad, open conversation about what the potential risks may be and try to get ahead of it as we continue progressing forward. But we should allow the risk to try and scare us from continuing to moving forward, because then that would be a stasis on progress. And that has never really done us any good, no matter whether it was the trying to attempt to ban stem cell production because people were afraid of the fact that at the time we were using fetuses, and today scientists are now able to extract stem cells from virtually any part of the body, and that came as a result of that progress, and we were able to address those risks. So that serves as an example of what we can apply by having those types of conversations while continuing to move forward within science and technology.
Yeah, so I want to segue into AI. Ben, can you, BJ, can you open up, BJ Murphy, can you please open up on the ethics of AI? Where do you see AI going? And as an ethicist, what are some of the broad but serious ethical implications of advancing AI?
Honestly, from my standpoint, I'm more concerned with not the how an artificial intelligence will respond to humans. I'm more concerned with how we will be able, or let me figure out the best way to put this. I'm more concerned with how humans will treat AI, what type of information that we feed it. Will we limit it to a sort of pinhole view in the same way that we did with that one artificial intelligence that was just being spoon-fed data straight from Twitter? And obviously the results from that was catastrophic. It became a sociopathic. Granted, it wasn't an AGI. It was basic AI, but it wasn't a good experiment because it had this limited perspective of reality that was solely based off of Twitter. And honestly, if anybody relied on Twitter the entirety of their life, I'm sure they would be a bit sociopathic themselves as well. So the way that we address AI as it continues growing and the closer that we get to developing an artificial general intelligence, we're going to have to start looking at AI in the same way that we sort of look at children. We need to be able to not be afraid to show it the world and be able to provide as much perspective as possible. But at the same time, we're also going to have to ensure that the information that it is given isn't being abused, isn't being used for more nefarious activities. I've been one to speak out against the idea of using artificial intelligence within the applications of war, because I feel like that would be a detrimental effect to the education of an AI, especially as we continue moving forward to the idea of an artificial intelligence operating at a similar intelligence capacity as that of the average human being. And if all it knows is war and Twitter, that would be quite detrimental for us. But if we continue showing it more of the world that we would, in the same way that we would with a child, I believe that we would be okay in the long run.
Yeah, absolutely. So Ben, what do you open up ethical considerations of AI as regards to the futurist New Deal?
Yeah. Well, to me, the ethical considerations of AI are a consideration for advanced algorithms progressing to a certain point. Is the concern is that we're getting a lot more man hours than we had, and that's a good problem to have. So the main concerns is strategizing on how to use that best. And again, I'll come back to something that I already shifted to before, which is the National Health Service and Public Health Service ideas. You know, we already have AI that is so good with medical imaging that radiologists are kind of changing the way they look at their jobs. We already have any number of other subfields in medicine where we could say much the same thing. We need to be using those things to firstly achieve this basic end of public health as in the broadest sense, certainly in a national context, but in a transnational context as well. And we need to be figuring out how we can do other things that would tend to set the stage for a truly post-industrial society as well. That's why I say that this basic income, in some ways, the tax reforms in the futurist New Deal, they're not entirely of my first choice. I don't necessarily think that it's the most fair thing for corporate tax rates to be capped at a certain relatively low percentage. This basic income that derives from the federal land dividend, what it does, in my view, is it sets everyone up to be able to be contributing more to this 21st century world, and in short order. This is something that could be implemented, in January of 2021, effectively. And other programs of this kind that are more revolutionary, they might not be quite as implementable. So again, all of these things, advanced algorithms, there's no discipline that's not touched by this. And we need to look at all of these disciplines very, very carefully and see how we can be using this technology to further the human species.
BJ, you mentioned a very good point, and I like this. It's what information we feed the AI. And in ethical considerations, there's Ben mentioned Grey Goo, but there's the paperclip theorem, where basically there's a paperclip manufacturer, and he programs an AI to build paperclips as efficiently as possible, and it starts converting all the matter across the world, across the universe, into paperclips because it has no directional focus. It's not limited. Do you think the AI bias? Do you think that can you expand on this input notion? As AI becomes more decentralized, well, it's already decentralized. There's billions of AI across the world, but as it becomes more easily to program, how do we control? How do we focus what inputs you are feeding into these AI?
Well, I think that question has been asked on a number of different topics, from drugs from the manufacturing of drugs to how we address the certain technologies that have emerged over the years. Do we put a moratorium on it? Do we open source it to the world? And if it's open source to the world and more people are starting to use it, how can we contain it? But really, if we do not open source a technology like artificial intelligence and not bring in as many people, as many eyes on this, we leave it to the risk that there's going to be somebody that will get a hold of it and there aren't as many checks and balances in place. There aren't as many eyes in place to ensure that somebody doesn't use it nefariously. Uh, so the idea that decentralization or the democratization of AI would result in this sort of paperclip idea where we have an AI that just keeps growing and growing. It has no input or no seeming bearing restraints to itself and what it's doing and how it may affect us. The more people that are involved means there's going to be a lot more perspective, a lot more insight, a lot more sensory awareness that will be applied into this growing technology. And it'll have the entire world really serving as its sort of ethical hand. It was Freeman Dyson who once said, and I'm sort of paraphrasing here, but he essentially said that the scientific and technological revolutions, in and of itself, technological innovation, however grand it may be, cannot and will not be enough. That in order for these new technologies that arise to ensure that they do not become new toys for the rich, we have to ensure that they are given, they're driven under an ethical hand. And that requires a lot more input, a lot more hands-on work from virtually anybody that wants to, but open source it into a community of people that are concerned about their lives, concerned about the future and direction that we're heading. The more people that are involved, the better off we're going to be. And the less amount of people that we try to put in, or the more that we try banning certain technologies, we're just leaving it up for a not decentralized in the sense of a democratization, but decentralization in the idea of there are going to be black market AI that are being used by people that are trying to avoid the legal restraints or the legal regulatory agencies. So again,
that's a good segue into my next question, Ben. I'll get back to you in just 1 second. How do we protect? How do we protect? How do we stop AI? Potentially bad AI, Ben, BJ, from falling into the hands of bad actors. How do we prevent that? Is it better security measures? Is it legislation? Is it what? How do we, because like I've seen the scary footage, the drone awareness where they have the mini drones and they come and they can assassinate people and all that sort of stuff. If a terrorist group or etc. Got a hand of that, I mean that's a formidable weapon. How do we stop that from happening?
Ben, do you want this one?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I can take that. I think.
All right. Yep. Yeah. Go, Ben. Go. Yep.
Yeah. So there's a lot of concerns around AI safety and an AI control problem, and but I think those are pretty low probability events. I would tend to take. Not err on the side of caution and maybe take the view of someone like Neil deGrasse Tyson, who says, if an AI gets too smart, hey, I know where the plug is. I can just unplug it. So there's a lot of people's concerns about this. It's folding in a lot of metaphysical business. What if a machine becomes like me? That's not really how machines have tended to operate in the past. And there is a very real prospect for the merger of human and machine, but that's a different set of concerns than what is often being voiced in this context. So the main concerns about superintelligence are more about mitigating these kind of paperclip maximizer concerns in Nick Bostrom's analogy, and also just more general supply chain concerns and ways in which our society is failing that we could sort of improve in public health concerns as well.
BJ, cybersecurity and protecting AI from falling into the hands of bad actors.
Well, we have to address it sort of in the same way that we've been addressing making sure that other bad actors don't get their hands on things like nuclear weapons. We need the whole world, especially having the UN, being not just aware of the promise and peril of these emerging technologies, but having proper legislation for it where all countries are united, at least insofar in how they develop these technologies, who benefits from them, and which and for what reasons. If there are certain methods, because to the UN, they're perfectly fine with implementing nuclear energy to be used from a broad application systems. You know, we have countries like China, Germany, even here in the United States, we have our own nuclear energy systems. Even though here in the United States, ours is a bit of a sham. We should be doing a lot better, but we're not. But they are fine with nuclear energy systems in that perspective. But when it comes to nuclear weapons, there's an obvious fight back from the UN and those that have signed the nuclear treaty to ensure that bad actors do not come into contact with these type of nuclear weapons. And if so, all these countries will be united as a front to address them and make sure that they don't actually use it. And we're going to have to apply the same methods that we do with things like nuclear weapons to that of like AI or rogue drones or whatever existential risk that may arise from these emerging technologies.
Ben, the Futurist New Deal focuses a lot on technological change. Do you think you're creating a disconnected society where human beings are fading out and they won't talk to each other? They're going to become more addicted to technology, or do you have social programs? Do you think that this increasing technology will actually help people to become more connected and more in tune with one another?
Yeah, well, this is largely an interface concern. The reason that your a 4-year-old shouldn't be using a tablet isn't because technology is bad. It's because there's nothing particularly naturalistic about staring at a screen relative to interacting with a real person, speech, and augmented reality uses. And you can kind of come at that from the other side when talking about stuff like Neuralace. But there is a platform point in the Futurist New Deal about e-learning and a different approach to K through 12 institutions. And there's any number of other implementations for e-services provided by the government. But by and large, this is a problem that's being fixed. Just as if you and maybe it's not being fixed as well as it could be. You know, if you ask Mark Zuckerberg what he thinks about a similar set of interface concerns around things like Cambridge Analytica, he says, well, you know, we can fix that now or 12 months from now with better kinds of detection. But you know, it's kind of pretty easy just to shine people on in that way. So I don't want to be the person doing that around these concerns for this dystopian scenario. But I do believe that the benefits that we've derived from these things dramatically outweighs this kind of like, oh, these millennials and their devices kind of talking point. But there are concerns there, and in every way we need to be advancing technology in a sort of ergonomic way and in a healthful way for the mental health of those concerned, and just in a smart way, as well as not a techno-sluggish way. We've been throwing that word around in some of these talks. So there's a definite balance to be there, but I think BJ and I are probably both more or less on the same page with wanting to first and foremost not get caught in the weeds with some of this stuff and keep us towards the techno-progressive as the primary agenda.
Do you agree with that? I'll give you a chance to respond. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I'm putting words in.
Yeah, I do largely agree with that. You know, when it comes to like a lot of these technologies and how we interact with them, and really, you know, and I keep saying this in all the questions that you've been throwing at me, that while we are sort of asking these new questions of AI and all these emerging technologies, the answer to them still sort of largely revolves around the way that we've answered a lot of the other age-old questions of how do we bring about this new form of life, or how do we ensure that something doesn't go wrong, or a certain technology isn't being used nefariously, or isn't affecting or isn't making a negative impact on society. And we've been addressing those concerns in many respects. And while we've sort of stumbled here, at least in the United States, in many respects, where there we're currently dealing with a lot of different issues, a lot of growing pains still taking place after hundreds of years here in the United States. We're still learning as a species that the more that we allow people to become their better selves, the more that we allow people to become part of the conversation, that we bring them in, whether that's through new technologies like the internet, or just within the political hemisphere, the more voices that are involved, the better off we'll be as a nation. And the same is going to be involved within these technologies, that from a techno-progressive standpoint, we want to ensure that these technologies are being distributed equitably through the general population, so that their input is involved, as opposed to having the input of someone up top. These private corporations like Amazon, like Google, like Facebook. It's great to have these Zuckerbergs and the Elon Musks and the Jeff Bezos around, given how much they've already contributed in from a technological standpoint. But at the same time, we're going to need everybody else's input involved as well, if we're going to ensure that these dystopian scenarios don't arise, and that we bring about something that is beneficial for all. And that's going to require everybody's voices, everybody's input.
That's a good point, and actually that segues onto my final sort of point. I don't, because I know it's very late over there, so I want to let you guys go. But
that's fine. I'm not now.
well, if you want. So wealth inequality. I mean, once you get the AI, you start to rule. Is there an issue with wealth inequality, that the super rich will become just more super rich, and it'll pull, and the poor are just going to be left in the dust? Is wealth inequality an issue? Whoever wants to take that one.
Yeah. Wealth inequality has been a major issue for some time, especially here in the United States. And this question has actually been, from a futurist perspective, has actually been here recently, been pursued. Zoltan Istvan had written an article on the relation of wealth inequality, of billionaires being involved within the longevity hemisphere, because he's doing that X Prize, that longevity X Prize, and he spoke out about the idea of this being a billionaires club. And I actually agree with Zoltan in many respects, in that this longevity revolution, as an example, that has taken place, where people are trying to combat age-related diseases and effectively bring about an all-around cure for aging in and of itself. We're going to need a lot more than the billionaires club involved, to ensure that there won't be a disparity between those that are going to be able to afford these transformational medical innovations and treatments, and those that are going to be left behind because they couldn't simply afford it. That's going to do is conjure up rebellions beyond anything that we've ever imagined. People have gone into riots just for trying to get cheaper products on Black Friday. What do you think people are going to do if they came to find out that there's an actual cure to cancer, or a cure to all age-related diseases as a whole, but you can't get it because you don't have the income to afford it, or you don't have the insurance to afford it? All that's going to do is conjure up a conflict between our species, and that's something that we cannot allow to happen. And that means ensuring that it's not going to remain a billionaires club. It goes back to what Freeman Dyson said, that in order for it to not, these technologies not become simply new toys for the rich, we're going to have to guide it with an ethical hand, and we're going to have to guide it with the world as a whole in mind, and having their ability, having their input, having their perspectives involved in the matter. Because if we don't, it will become just a billionaires club, and that wealth disparity, that wealth gap, is going to turn into a health gap, and we don't want it to reach that point.
Benzion, as a candidate,
And
as a candidate, do you worry about the wealth inequality to do with AI?
Yeah, absolutely. It's very high on my list, maybe even higher than concerns about techno sluggishness. Although those things do tie into one another. This isn't just a black pill scenario where there is something that is secretly kept from people. A lesser iteration of that is a scenario where something. Liz Parrish would be able to offer some service to people, but the market isn't prepared for it. The regulatory frameworks are not prepared for it. People are not don't have the cultural literacy to adapt it, so it becomes an orphan product, and that also, like the sort of more Civil War kind of scenario, represents some number of deaths resulting from that. It's a little bit more of a soft genocide, but it's still people dying because we were not smart enough to figure out how to do something right. And that's one of my biggest concerns, but I think it does very closely relate to my other big concern, which is that concept of techno sluggishness in this area. Income inequality is a huge problem, and in the United States, we've seen income inequality grow to near epidemic levels over the past 4 decades. I think owing in large part to the actions of people who call themselves right libertarians, like Charles Koch, who have managed to create a corporatist states of America. And there's all manner of concerns that we have to address, and that the Futurist New Deal does actively address. And I could happily delineate those. But the main thing to say is that we need to strengthen our middle class and create a society that can sustain the kind of longevity escape velocity ultimately that we see on the horizon in the very near term, perhaps.
VJ Murphy. So, for example, we had Charlie Cam on, who is he's an adherent to the teachings of Rage Kurzweil, and he argues that all of this wealth inequality stuff doesn't mean anything because, and he always goes on about the price point will drop as the consumers adopt. The price point is going to drop to the point where, like mobile phones, he said, like TVs, like these mass consumer products that have dropped over time as they've improved with Moore's law and as they've improved with production manufacturing efficiency and as the distribution methods have got easier from supermarkets and retail outlets to online retail outlets. These distribution methods, along with the price point, have pushed these arguments of wealth inequality and to technological adoption out the window. What do you say to Charlie Cam on this point?
Well, I would say that it's easy to have that kind of perspective when you don't currently live in poverty. There are millions of people here in the United States that still do not have proper health insurance or are working 3 to 4 jobs in their given day just to try to survive and make the basic ends meet. Sure, we can make the argument that the technology that will help us will eventually drop down in price. It will increase in efficiency in the same way that phones and computers have, and that's that's a fine argument. It's an argument that I've made in the past before as well. But at the same time, how long do we have to wait for the price point to go down low enough for them to accommodate us? We already have, here in the United States, we're in a particular situation where we have, like I said, millions of people without health care. And yet we have a bunch of billionaires already leaping into the idea of, well, maybe we should bring about indefinite life extension or quote unquote immortality. They're getting involved in the longevity question. And yet here in the United States, we still do not have a proper healthcare system where everybody is involved. We have this idea that we can talk about longevity for all, but yet we're still not talking about healthcare for all. So whenever I hear people talk about, well, these are non-factors, the idea of a wealth gap or a gap in the number of people that have actual medical care, this comes from a viewpoint of people that just simply do not deal with poverty on a daily basis. and they have absolutely no idea what people are going through and how long they're going to have to continue going through, because people are dying right now. People are dying because they don't have health care. People are dying because they live in abject poverty. And yet they want to talk about, well, just wait another decade or two, things will be fine. I'm sorry, it's not a good argument. It's We have to start thinking about the here and now as well, just as much as we are thinking about the future, because there are a lot of people in the here and now that aren't going to be able to witness and benefit from this future if we don't start making policies within the political hemisphere that address these concerns today. Because if we don't address the concerns of the wealth disparity, if we don't address the concerns of healthcare today, then these issues are only going to exacerbate over time, especially as we can start including more technologies that only a select few are going to be able to actually access and benefit from.
Ben, if you're familiar with Charlie Cam, the Cam Kurzweil
Sure, yeah.
thesis on this, the democratization of these technologies due to the price point, you agree or not?
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, hey, I'm a singularitarian, you're a singularitarian, you're a singularitarian. But yeah, we have to do a little better than that. The Futurist New Deal has a federal land dividend which is intended to raise $173 trillion over 10 years, enough to fund a $52,000 minimum income for every adult in this country. It is also enough to fill in the gaps in our public health system. We should have a national public health service. We don't. It's limited to a few specific subsets of the population. As BJ said, that is unacceptable in the country that is 4 times richer than the next closest country in terms of GDP. We really have to be doing better. And there's, in my view, the shortest distance to doing that is to create this additional revenue stream. There's an awful lot of other things that we are attempting to do with the Futurist New Deal in terms of tax reforms and other kinds of regulation, and even 1 or 2 kinds of deregulation. But we have to first and foremost stop the bleeding in the destruction of our middle class, and give people the ability to live well, and that is through a basic income and this third point, the third highest order point of the Futurist New Deal, which is Medicare for all.
BJ, you're familiar with Ben Goertzel. Ben Goertzel's talking about super intelligent AI in the future that pretty much have godlike status. Do you agree with this? Do you think that Ben Goertzel's right, that AI will become a godlike entity within the universe that we create?
Well, honestly, I think Ben Goertzel is probably one of the most intelligent persons that I know, and quite frankly, I do believe that he is on the right path and the right understanding of where AI is going, especially in terms of the development of artificial general intelligence. More specifically, though, what I agree with Ben Goertzel, he recently ended up doing a response to, I believe it was Microsoft that made a big announcement where they were funding Elon Musk's company, OpenAI, I believe it was. And Ben Goertzel made some concerns on the idea of this corporatization of AI, and as opposed to his plans through his own efforts over in China that he's been working on artificial general intelligence systems. He wants to try to democratize and open source and try to bring as many people involved to get involved into the AI and be the benefactors of its development. Because the more people that are benefiting from it, the more people that become benefactors of the growth of AI, the more they will become invested in seeing this AI grow properly, as opposed to the corporatization of AI, which with Microsoft or any other company getting involved, that lends the risk of not that many people being involved and really corporate interest taking precedence in the development and growth of an artificial intelligence, which may or may not have the interest of everybody else, especially in terms of our environment, considering we're currently going through a climate crisis right now. Uh, we have to ensure that the interest of everybody is involved, and the corporatization of AI won't do it. Ben Wurtzel, I believe, is on the right path when he talks about the democratization of AI and bringing everybody along for the ride and having them serve as benefactors for the growth of AI.
Then, do you agree with Ben Goetzel that one day we might invent a super intelligent AI that's godlike in its power and status?
Yeah, I think that's effectively a given. uh, but I also agree with him in the sense that BJ said of even guys who are quite acquisitive in this area are willing to allow that when we're getting to algorithms with this level of advancement, that we really need an open source and a kind of even going beyond that, public domain and fully transparent. Peter Thiel and Elon Musk and some other guys putting a little bit of money into this AI safety thing in California. And I do happen to believe that some of what they're doing is more about a certain kind of protectionism for their organizations and industries than it is about actual existential risk. But there are things that could go quite wrong if we don't have an awful lot of transparency in this. One thing that came up in our last talk on this, Steele, was the idea that some national interest could develop this, and that national interest could very well be DARPA, China, of course, being the main one, where you have quite a bad situation where one country is really able to foist its will upon everyone else and disrupt all manner of industries and create a situation. It is a worst case scenario, but it is a credible scenario of cyber wars spiraling into some instability that could lead to a great number of fatalities.
So sorry, you respond, BJ.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Ben Wurtzel was also on Joe Rogan's podcast not that long back, and they were talking about similar topics of artificial intelligence and what would be the risk factor of it growing into a super intelligence and how it would be used by national interests. And to be quite frank, I agree with him when he said that he was less concerned of what China would do with AI than what he is of the U.S. government and military interests, just because of the fact that the United States has a track record, an unfortunate track record of putting its military interests before its own people, and when it comes to their health, to their social well-being, and ensuring companies like DARPA or the corporatization that we're seeing here in the United States to ensure that these emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, whether it grows into an AGI, whether it grows into a super intelligence, making sure that these corporate and military type interests are not involved within the growth and development of an AI should be one of our number one concerns, especially here in the United States, because our track record is not something that we should be going home and praising. We should be doing everything we can to fix the mistakes that we've made in history, and that means not getting so involved in military war ventures and not using artificial intelligence and allowing us to do that much more easily, I should say.
That's very interesting. Sorry, Ben. Yeah, go on. Yep.
Well, and we can't assume that that it's very easy to say that what kind of maniac would allow that to happen, because in a certain light, this is a post-scarcity framework that we're describing, and that post-scarcity framework, a lot of the things that are just pure greed, you can forgive a little bit of that if it's really, really rippling out in a big way. And again, this is getting into like right-wing thought experiment territory, and it's easy to say like what kind of maniac would be the person who would actually be doing the bad stuff, but we could have said the same thing 100 years about the climate crisis. what kind of organizations would allow this to happen? I don't think that could ever possibly happen. Well, it is happening, and we would see that kind of hyper-capitalist madness in play if the United States was that singleton, effectively, in ways that China wouldn't to the same degree. But I think the main concern there is things more on the order of paperclip maximizer concerns and income inequality concerns than Terminator kind of concerns.
BJ, you talked before of a civil war. If it was to come out somewhere that, you know, a lab somewhere was on the verge of breaking this, you know, creating a general artificial intelligence or a self-learning intelligence or something like that, would it be then? Would we see a bunch of groups, left-wing groups, right-wing groups, Christian groups, you know, different sides of the Christian groups, Luddite group, all these different groups who would then, it would be a scramble for this AI, you know what I mean, versus say something like the government or versus the company or the corporate entity that's building this? Would there be a mass scramble for it, whether to access it, take it, destroy it, or whatever? I mean, is this a possibility? Would there be a huge scramble for this AI?
Well, it's a possibility, but, you know, whether it be a huge scramble or it's distributed evenly for everybody to benefit from will largely depend on how the government and those that are more directly involved in the development of AI address it. You know, will they keep it for themselves? Will the race for an artificial general intelligence squarely revolve around the interest of the military and corporations, or will it be largely revolved around the general applications for everybody to benefit from? And that goes back to like Ben Wurzel's hopes of democratizing and open sourcing it. And if we were able to do that, there wouldn't be so much of a scramble, as everybody would have access to it. The more, you know, and Ben was just talking about this, you know, we're talking about a framework of post-scarcity. And as we've seen in the past, that whenever we try limiting a product or a technology or so, there's usually a scramble as a result of it. We see this all the time with Black Friday. We have that one-day deal come in and you'll get this product or so-and-so for a half price off. People are scrambling, they're rioting, they're stomping down doors just to get this product that's probably going to be meaningless in the next year or so. But you see this scramble because of a engineered scarce condition that have been applied into this product. And so with a technology that goes beyond the framework of scarcity, that goes beyond this concept of that only a limited number of people should have access to it, but instead everybody should have access to it, then we start destroying these sort of barriers, these sort of mental psychological barriers that force us in the idea that we need to scramble and try to grab as much as we need. If there's access for everybody, there isn't going to be a scramble. People are just going to use it and benefit from it. And the closer that we can get to that point, the better off we will be.
Ben, did you have anything to add, or I'll ask you another question?
Yeah, no, I did have something to add. It's a really good idea to talk about these things in as discrete of terms as possible. And one way to do that is to talk about prototypes. Some examples would be in this specific area would be with something that we've talked about a number of times, a Neuralace, or more robust versions of Google Assistant. A Google Assistant can already, in its best form, can already be kind of providing the front end of a small business to everyone for free. So that's something that's dumping untold man hours into the marketplace, allowing people to better run small businesses and concerns of this kind. So that's the kind of effect that we would ultimately hope to be seeing, and we have to try and parse those things. You can say the very same thing of something like Neuralace, that it would have those good effects. There's also maybe some emerging culture things around that could be a little spooky, and also some runaway things besides in there. But I would say that those are good runaway things. This is a selling point from Elon Musk, this this arms race between cyborg and superintelligence. That's the main reason why he says that we should have this product available not only to otherly abled people but to guys like us, because we want to be able to not have the tail wagging the dog. We want to be the dog in control, and a good way to do that vis-a-vis superintelligence would be to be using something like Neuralink.
But it's also, would you say, Ben, beneficial that they are starting from a medical standpoint when it comes to the Neuralace, that people that truly would benefit from it, from dealing with certain psychological issues or brain-related diseases, to have the Neuralace to serve as a sort of a stepping stone in addressing those concerns. And then as more applications start being presented through the Neuralace, more people start becoming involved. It's kind of like I had written an article for IET years back where I talked about how the disabled would and should be in the front of the line when it comes to the cyborgization of the human species, because those that are disabled and are be able to not only become able-bodied once more through these emerging technologies, through cyborg tech and things like the Neuralace, robotic limbs, they would go beyond the concept of able-bodied. They'd be the first to sort of enter this transhuman world. And as a result, this would then shift our understanding and definition of what it means to be disabled in this era of transhumanism. Is being disabled mean not having a limb, when people who don't have limbs now have robotic arms that are far more efficient than our biological organic limbs that those of us in the able-bodied sphere are relying on? What is the definition of disability? And so by bringing in the people that would receive the most impact from these technological advancements, like the disabled, those that are dealing with medical issues, especially brain-related diseases, the Neuralace being used for medical applications first and foremost builds a bridge for that community, not just into the scientific community, but also builds a bridge for all of us to start considering the seriousness of these technologies and how beneficial they'll be for everybody, especially as more people become involved and more people benefit from it.
Yeah, and I think it also might behoove us to relate this also to aging in this specific context. There's a person who is so there is a downside to Neuralace in a certain sense. It's almost there. I just read an article that said that equated it to something akin to suicide to do this. So there's such a seismic shift in identity and memory in implementing something like this that the early adapters are going to be doing some strange things. But it is whatever that is. I don't want to catastrophize it because I don't hold to that view. But whatever it is, it's something where elderly people or otherly able people might be able to experience that and give us a fuller idea of how that. You cut out for a second, so if there was a question there I didn't hear.
Yeah, no, I was just filibustering until the time you arrive back. But I like these points, and I think these points are really vital. I wanted to shift gears a little bit. So we talk about super AI. What about in the short term? Is robotic sentience? I mean, I know in the U.S. Transhumanist Party platform and charter, you talk about sentient beings. BJ, you're an ethicist. Can robots suffer? Can AI suffer? Should we be good to AI because it's going to start thinking soon? And can we hurt its feelings, etc.?
Well, can we hurt its feelings now? No. But for the future, there is the possibility that not only will an artificial intelligence become increasingly cognitively intelligent, but will also increasingly become emotionally intelligent. And that would mean having certain feelings that would be akin to how we feel as a species. And with that in mind, I would argue that, yeah, we should treat AI and robotics in the same care that we treat other human beings. It sort of goes back to the idea of, judge unto others as you would want them to judge unto you, or to how to treat your neighbor with kindness and don't be a dick. Whether it's a human, a robot, or an artificial intelligence, try to treat it with as much care as much as you would want for it to care for you, because artificial intelligence and robotics, they are going to be caring for us in many respects, especially for the elderly, those that are, again, disabled. They're going to care for us, so why should we not care for them? And plus, there's a psychological benefit to being able to take care of robots and not being so mean or violent towards them, because obviously when it comes to like the robotics industry, we try to anthropomorphize them. We try to give them features that are sort of human-like for us to sort of relate to and be able to resonate with. And that's because from a psychological standpoint, whenever we have something that we can relate to or something that looks like us, we are far less likely to cause harm to it. There have been studies with children where they would feel sad for a robot that is malfunctioned or is being attacked than, say, an adult, because for them, their perspective is this is a living creature. They don't know any better right now, obviously, but they look at it from the standpoint of this is a living creature. We shouldn't be harming this. We shouldn't be harming other living creatures. And so as artificial intelligence and robotics, they start entering the world where we could feasibly consider them a quote unquote living creature with emotional intelligence and cognitive intelligence, being careful with them, being considerate of them should be a prime directive for us. Again, it goes back to how we treat others. If we can treat them with care, they'll treat us with care, and we won't have a robopocalypse as a result. So it'll be beneficial for everybody.
Ben Zion, your campaign, does it take into the account the consciousness of near sentience of robots, the suffering of robots, all that?
Yeah, well, it came up in the debate that you and I then did the postmortem of on your show, where I kind of got a gotcha question about this. And that was because I had made some statements that were mildly critical of this idea of robot sentience, and so I want to unpack that a little bit more, because most of what BJ was saying about this enhancing empathy and uplifting in general, the prospect of uplifting of AI or of other creatures enhances our empathy and understanding of what it is to be a living thing, and how to better treat living things, and that is a great value. That is a great value added there. But I should also say that we have to kind of look at this in terms of what's actually going to happen. 50 years from now, we may have, or 20 years from now, we may have this ability. But it seems like to do it now is to build a huge design flaw. To try and do it now is to build a huge design flaw and a huge money pit into the functioning of advanced algorithms. Now, there are maybe shorter term paths to this, like what we were just discussing, Neuralace, or other cyborgization efforts that are quite fully realized, maybe not as fully realized as Neuralace. But if we try to create a creature that can feel pain and that has existential crap, that's without first having achieved a more full cyborgization and a society that's really contemplated what that's going to look like. I think that could be described as the actions of a madman.
Yeah. So BJ, are you familiar with well, I think you would be, but I, Robot, the movie or the book by Isaac Asimov?
Very much so.
Well, yeah. So you know the character Sonny in there, right? He's
Right.
built outside of the AI framework of the superintelligence that's over that world in order to help sort of humanity escape if they need it. Do you think that this is an AI safeguard? So, for example, if you have a sort of a narrow intelligence that's a thinking capacity that can be an ally in assisting, and it could also teach these other things like empathy. It could also teach, all these other sort of emotional intelligence things because if you look at the way, because the concern I have is the way humans have treated animals on the planet is fairly bad, and they're already living creatures. I mean,
Right.
You see a pizza
But it's-
delivery.
but
You
we're-
see the
but we're
pizza
also
delivery in the U.S. They kick the robots already. I mean, human nature. What do you think?
Right. Well, there are aspects of human nature where we're still these primitive, violent beasts trying to, my friend Tim Cannon from Grindhouse Wetware, biohacker, he loves talking about how we're still slaves to our reptilian brain in many respects. Where if we have low blood sugar, we're gonna come off as a bit agitated. We're gonna come off as a bit hostile, and it's not to our own fault. It's just the fact that we haven't eaten anything. We need to build up our blood sugar, and so our bodies operate in these strange ways, and we react in strange ways in many respects. And unfortunately, that sort of turns into scenarios that tend to be a bit more violent and dramatic in the way that we treat other animals and robots and so on and so forth. But in many respects, we're also growing as a species as we continue this adventure, where this journey of ours, where the more we learn about each other, the more that we learn about other animal systems, the more that we learn about our climate, the more empathetic that we become as a species. And that doesn't mean that there aren't going to be people out there that are still going to do terrible things. We should always be vigilant to address them whenever they may arise. But I would say that largely we are growing as a species to where we're starting to treat animals better than we had otherwise. The veganism movement has grown to a level now where people are actually we've got Impossible Burgers in Burger King, where people are actually taking the time to enjoy animal cruelty free products. So there's a sort of consciousness shift that we're witnessing in terms of how we treat other living beings, and that will, in my opinion, transfer to the way that we address things like robotics and artificial intelligence. There will, of course, be people that will try to treat them negatively, and with the iRobot and Asimov stories, one of the biggest lessons that he gave in those stories was it isn't so much that we should have tried to control AI from this limited framework like the three laws of robotics, because it was the three laws of robotics that resulted in this catastrophe of robots not operating as naturally and as beneficially towards all these scenarios that are being thrown at them from a human perspective, because they don't really learn. We don't adhere to the three laws of robotics as humans, so why should they? They should have a much more broader perspective, a much broader understanding of the world in the same respects we are. The more that we increase our intelligence of the world and of each other, of our climate, of animals, of other living beings, the more empathetic I believe we will become towards all of these categories, and that will also apply to robotics and artificial intelligence. It needs a broader perspective.
Do you have anything to add to that, Ben?
Yeah. Well, this is the opposite side of what we were talking about. The downside of empathy in this advanced algorithm framework. We're already seeing a lot of it. There's an awful lot of people that have some form of new media fatigue. There's an awful lot of people that feel like they're being made into automatons. There's a gig economy and other effects of this kind. And we can see this kind of hyper-capitalist a snowball effect where we're all kind of living in an Orwellian or Kafkaesque horror. It's not that hard to imagine based on one view of the trajectory of where things are going. But the main thing I think is that we talked about this in the context of Neuralace. Neuralace and some other advanced algorithms that would be something that could effectively create a parallel self, that might allow me to have a richer family life. That might allow me to have a less new media fatigue and less gig economy kinds of things. So it all comes down to what I said. The first thing I said about AI, which is that this is a good problem to have, because the main thing that's going to be happening is just a huge influx of human capital into markets, and the best that we can do is speed that and also legislate responsibly for it.
BJ, I have a question for you. You mentioned the proliferation of sort of this consciousness of animals, the vegan movement, the green movement, the all this sort of stuff. It started out in the 80s with World Peace Day and all that, and the Bono stuff. It's been moving forward. I want to know from you: do you think that this is because humans, as a whole, at least in advanced economies, are feeling that the robots are coming and they're evolving? It's a selfish evolutionary trait where now they know to survive, they have to be more peaceful. They have to be more benevolent as a survival mechanism, as an evolutionary trait.
That's a possibility. Well, I mean, anybody that's really studied like Charles Darwin and natural selection and everything from evolution, from an evolutionary perspective, those that are able to survive these huge transformational shifts that occur from time to time over time are usually those that are able to adapt with change the best. It isn't so much about competing against one another or trying to be the dominant species. It's about solely how well you're able to adapt to new changes in the horizon, whether it's an environmental change, whether it's a climatic change, whether it's a technological change. So we see these technologies arising. We know what is coming, and we're trying to prepare and we're trying to adapt in the most beneficial way to ensure that they don't come as a result to our own detriment and come to our own benefit instead. And so that requires us to be more adaptive with these technologies. And so being prepared for them and making sure that we're treating our climate much more fairly than we have otherwise, and treating other animals fairly than we had otherwise. That all just comes from a grander understanding of what we've done and what is coming and how we can best address the issues of the past and adapt to future conditions that may arise.
Benzine, do you think this consciousness shift in a general sense is an evolutionary trait? It's a method of survival?
No, I mean, it is that would describe one of many network effects and techno-progress effects, I think. But I think that, it is as much to do with the open society paradigm or panopticon effect. It's as much to do with just greater providence over these last few decades. There's an awful lot of things very wrong with this world in terms of income inequality. But, prior to the internet era, there were about 5 times as many people who didn't have access to potable water as there are today. That number is under 1 billion now. And so this is a feature of things of this kind, just the stabilization of societies. And there's a lot of things we could point to. So that's a very real effect. But I think we could point to a number of others that might account for that correlation.
All right. Well, this has been a fascinating conversation. Have I missed anything? Would you like to talk about anything that I've missed, BJ, before we start to wrap up? I don't know what the time is there in the US. I don't want to keep you guys up.
I'll leave that up to Ben. He's the one that brought us all here.
Okay.
All right. Yeah, Ben, go.
I would like to talk more about data science and biomedicine, the confluences there. We kind of both alluded to this idea that this is kind of a right-wing thought experiment. We don't have, you put a finer point on it even, that we don't have a national health service in the United States. We have 30,000 people a year dying because they just don't have health insurance. That number's come down in the last decade a little bit, but it could be a lot lower. It should be a lot lower. We should have Medicare for all right now. It's a disgrace that we do not. That being said, there are ways, we can imagine a country that doesn't have even the public health infrastructure that the U.S. has, and a leapfrogging scenario where we're having biomedicine and data science kind of filling in some of those gaps in those constant monitoring and intervention frameworks that I described. And if people want to check out some talks about that, Paul Spiegel and I did a podcast. I can link that in the comments here, where we talked about this quite a bit. It came up in the Florian Marcus talk. It came up in a few others. I can link all of those. But my feeling is that there's a lot of talk amongst transhumanists about planned communities. We're gonna get our own reservation in Australia. Why not? We're gonna go start a wonderful mosquito coast country, or we're gonna go to the Luxembourg and they're gonna welcome us with open arms. We're gonna have our own little city there. Whatever, this or that. There's seasteading, the whole list of things. But to my mind, that is also kind of a money pit, and also kind of a quixotic endeavor. But finding a country that is small enough that their public health service could be influenced by a small legal fund, and that they have pretty good public health outcomes. I can think of a few. And then basically you have what is effectively a reality show. Here were these people who were having normal life spans, a little lower than the average man in the U.S., quite a bit lower than the average woman in the U.S. And now every one of them is effectively a life extensionist. And why the hell isn't the rest of the world doing this? That seems highly implementable to me, based on the current state of advanced algorithms and the current state of medical technology. And it's really something that I'd like to be talking more with people about, and maybe the far future stuff around it as well.
I have to get is it Chile? Is the Easter Island owned by Chile? I don't know. President of the Easter Island or whatever. We'll have him on.
Yeah, that's a Chilean.
Chile, yeah. Well, that sucks. Maybe we should make Easter Island independent, and we can send you there. You can be the overlord of Easter Island.
Well, in practical terms, this is a conversation that I've had with people in private and public. Some small Polynesian islands that are sovereign. But in practical terms, most people who are looking at seriously doing some of this, and some of them I have spoken to recently, they are often looking at other countries, developed countries that are in Central and Southern Europe, for applying these kind of data science and emerging biomedicine implementations.
Well, it's unfortunate because the reason why we don't really have that much activity from, like, here in the United States as a whole, our U.S. government does not get as involved within these emerging technologies, I think it largely just revolves around the fact that our governments, whether it's the U.S. government or British government or what have you, a lot of them are just technologically illiterate. They have no perspective of what is actually coming. They have no perspective on how it's actually going to impact us as a society, and that we're going to have to start building a wide-spanning educational movement that coincides with everything that we're doing from a technological and scientific standpoint. Josiah Zayner, the biohacker, he's been trying to address the issue with California putting that bill forward where they're trying to limit the way that CRISPR kits and biohacking is implemented within the human body. Josiah Zayner is responding to this through his own personal educational courses and classes, and he's offering free classes for any politician that would like to take part in these classes to get a better, broader perspective of biohacking, a much more accurate understanding of biohacking. So I think that's if we can sort of figure out a way to expand that from a nationwide and even a global scale, this education, to be able to educate them on the technologies that are coming, the scientific practices that are coming, that are arising as a result of these innovations, the better off we'll be in terms of how the government will be able to respond, how private corporations will be able to respond, how people in general will be able to respond to these technologies, because they'll become a lot more technologically literate of what is coming, how it will impact us, and how it will benefit us, and to what extent. So we're going to have to, like I said, we're going to have to build a sort of educational movement that coincides, that operates in parallel with everything that we're doing here. If we want to ensure that it isn't just some random sovereign island several miles off the coast of the ocean, that they're the only ones that are somehow involved in benefiting from this.
Yeah, I think one of the main reasons is because, like, the U.S., for example, is competing on so many fronts. So, Ben, you mentioned that your leaders don't seem to have technological expertise, but that's because they're competing on financial fronts, economic fronts. They're competing with their own history. They're putting a lot of money into ensuring political elections. They've got infrastructure to build. They've got roads to maintain. They've got a whole swath of issues, and departments and things, and they're not just focused on this one issue, of technology. You get a smaller country like the U.S. is a big driver of innovation. Maybe you argue it's a bit slow, but it's a superpower in that respect. You get a smaller country which isn't competing on so many fronts, Switzerland or Israel, for example. And suddenly you can see that shift. That, like, Benjamin Netanyahu, for example, in Israel, is massive on these technologies. I mean, Israel is a cyber superpower in some respects. But they have to compete on other fronts. They're stuck out there in the Middle East. We got to build a wall, to keep the Palestinians out or whatever. I mean, there's other things going on in a country, not just technology. Do you know what I mean?
Well, you don't have to be the world's foremost authority with multiple PhDs to have a healthier view of scientism than our society does. I interviewed two gentlemen one of whom was close friends with the gentleman who founded the technocracy movement in 1920, a movement which, like Fabian socialism, could be said to have had very far-reaching implications in the 20th and early 21st century, continuing. And some of those things may have tapered off in our country specifically, but there's every sense in which, by the standards of when these ideas were conceived of, we now live in a Fabian socialist and technocratic kind of utopia relative to those times. And now, not the United States, there's no real country that we could describe as full technocracy. China's kind of close. But these individuals who I spoke to, they have ideas about changing the monetary system and changing the way that governance is conceived of entirely. But in that ideology is a deep respect for scientism and a deep respect for techno progress that, as BJ pointed out, is, we're literally we could just replace our Congress with just a bunch of baboons throwing their shit at the wall, and we would probably have an equally technocratic society. So we need to really not just talk about the literacy of individuals, but holding to account our institutions.
Right. And to try to address what you were saying, Steele, with the United States being so large, even with that respect, because we have a large population, we have over 300 million to date as the total population, and we have a wide span in terms of land and the number of issues that we're dealing with. That still, in my mind, is not a good excuse as to how far behind we are from a technological standpoint. China is much larger. They have a significantly larger population, significantly larger landmass, significantly larger number of issues that they're having to address, and yet from a technological standpoint, they are far more literate than we are as a nation state. Xi Jinping, their leader, he every now and then he does shows off like his bookshelf to show what he's reading and what that means in respect to how they're directing their policies. And one of those bookshelves that he showed off where he was reading about artificial intelligence. He was reading the types of books that we futurists have been trying to push on U.S. politicians here for quite some time. And that comes from this proactive idea that they recognize what is coming. They are technologically literate of what is emerging and what type of impacts it is going to make on their society, and they're trying to get ahead of it. And that's why they're they are growing to become this technological superpower. It's why even today they are practically the world leader in terms of renewable energy and tech manufacturing and adherence in terms of fighting climate change. Whereas here in the United States, we are falling behind, drastically behind in every respect, from a technological standpoint, from a social standpoint, from a health standpoint. We are just refusing, our government is refusing to become literate of these issues. And that is where we're going to have to, excuse me, that is where we're going to have to try and address the issue of why we're so far behind. It's because that has no, it doesn't matter how big of a nation they are, how much of a total population they have, or how many number of issues they have. If they are willing to learn and willing to become more involved in these advancements and try to get ahead of these curves, the better off they're going to be. And China is showing just the progress that comes from it. Whereas over on our end here in the United States, we're showing what happens when we choose not to become more involved and become more literate of it. We're still fighting, for Christ's sake, we're still fighting over GMOs right now. We're still fighting over the idea of whether a person should be vaccinated. We're still fighting over whether somebody should have healthcare, whether healthcare is a human right. We're still fighting over these basic issues that countries like China and really any other industrial developed nation has already answered these questions. And for us, we need to start answering these questions now. We need to increase the literacy, technological standpoint, and help benefit us as a nation.
You know, those are all good points, but I'd like to point out that, and I agree with you. As America has a relative decline, and it's relatively declining compared to all other countries as they're rising. So it's a relative decline. It's not a dramatic collapse of the whole system. It's not a system-wide collapse, but it's a relative decline. You know you know, people get fearful and they turn to God, so they elect. But this is inherent with democracy. Okay, so you're a democratic country. So you mentioned you're still fighting over GMOs, but isn't that that's a healthy debate in a democracy? I mean, it's not an authoritarian state. Well, I mean, Ben might disagree. He might say Trump's overlord, but
well, I mean, we're not the only democracy in the world, and we are a representative democracy. There are various other incarnations of democracy that are adhered to throughout various different nations.
But as a global innovator, you're an absolute leader.
Already addressed.
We've never had it. The world has never seen very much of a representative government, and we're on the verge of having the ability to have that now. But I did want to say something else about
the argument you're trying to brush off the fact that you're a global leader of innovation, and you guys absolutely are a global leader of innovation. Just because China is on a debt-fueled super bubble and they concern themselves with this, and Ben Goertzel said China's cool, I mean, doesn't necessarily lay down all the facts that this is the absolute end-all truth of it.
Well, to be fair, Ben Goertzel. To be fair, Ben Goertzel never said that China is quote unquote cool. He just says that they are addressing these situations a lot more beneficially because they are not putting the concept of science of things like GMOs as something that should be up for debate. We know from a scientific standpoint that GMOs do not negatively impact the environment. We know that they don't negatively affect human consumption. We know that climate change is affecting the world, that it is indeed real, that it is indeed largely caused from man-made causes. These are issues that are not up for debate anymore. Democracy is irrelevant when it comes to these scientific understandings. And so even if we are a democracy, and it may be healthy to have certain debates about certain topics, there's no doubt about that. But there are certain topics where the debate is long over, and we need to get over it, and we need to become more literate of these technologies and scientific practices and get on board. Stop having these stupid debates that aren't going to benefit us whatsoever. It's just going to continue creating this stasis where we continue not growing while other nations are growing because they've ended the debate. They know, they understand from a scientific standpoint what is true and what is not, what is a pure fictional opinion that has no merit with reality, and what viewpoints do merit with that of reality and our understanding of science and technology.
Ben, jump
China's
in.
able to do that. On our end, we're not able to.
And I think some of this, there's not, these are not polar opposites. Ben Goertzel also, and I'm paraphrasing here as well, he said, I've heard him say a few times in talking about the new sphere, and that, what about the role of these syndicates and these monopolists and these kind of corporatist and military partnerships like that we would see in DARPA. Don't we want to encourage that? But he says to that the bigger syndicate is the new sphere itself, and the citizen scientist, and in looking at China, we don't have to say that this is an either or scenario. China has that orientation towards scientism, that results-oriented kind of metrics in the way that they run these things, and in the way that there are a lot of failings there, just even on that specific issue around state-run capitalism, but they're failing up because they have that commitment to scientism as a people and as a nation. The United States doesn't exactly have that in the same way, but we do have this great benefit of kind of having been the birthplace of many of these technologies, and we're still kind of, I believe, running on exhaust from that. If we don't change our orientation, we're that exhaust is going to run out pretty soon.
Please let it be clear that I agree with both of you. Yeah. We're running on. Let it be clear that I agree with both of you that there needs to be a shift in the consensus, that there needs to be a shift in the political leanings, and the debate up the top. But it's all the innovation that's happening in the US is happening despite. So imagine when the shift happens, it's going to be enormous. It's going to be absolutely enormous because you're already such a superpower in that state. And with China's stolen a lot of that technology. They've leaped ahead a lot because of the low wages issue, because they've had a lot of low wages. They were basically slave labor, and a whole bunch of other factors that's propelled them, and the fact that they're innovating and becoming historically, China has been basically a superpower since the beginning of civilization existed. I mean, no one's arguing that China isn't going to be a supermassive feature going forward into the future. Absolutely supermassive. It's always been supermassive historically. So I'm not concerned about that, and I think that China's very smart to innovate on these things and push forward with this agenda. And part of that that it's being fueled through theft. Part of it's being fueled because of resentment from the former Soviet Union, which is Russia, which is now feeding them a lot of tech. They've got good relationships with Israel underhand, where that they're getting work out. So China's playing a lot of very good games there, and unfortunately for China, I mean, they have, if it wants to advance supermassively, they would steal Japan off of the United States. They would rip Japan out of the U.S. orbit, and they would take all that tech, and they would advance a lot. I mean, one of the main reasons that the U.S., and you can argue maybe this is an argument, that the U.S. has outsourced, offshored a lot of its innovation and tech to Japan, to South Korea, and to some of these other countries, Taiwan. Okay, so that's where all your tech sector actually is. It's not just onshore down the road at Alcor or up on Capitol Hill. It's actually being outsourced because of the US dollar and a bunch of treaty arrangements to these other countries, which you guys probably don't conceptualize because it's not mainland and or Alaska. Thoughts?
Let's be clear. China has in the past dealt with the theft of certain technologies to help boost their technological impact. But if anybody's really been paying attention to what China's been doing from a scientific and technological standpoint here in the last few years, they've been shifting away from this idea of stealing from others and are now creating a massive platform for their own actual products that they are innovating in and of themselves. So they are quickly moving in their own direction from a Chinese perspective. And the rest of the world should be taking notes in terms of how they address these particular issues when it comes to technologies, when it comes to our climate, because again, we're a multipolar world, and we do not have the time, because given the latest IPCC reports of saying that we have until like 2030 to diminish a certain amount of input of carbon into our atmosphere, or else we're going to find ourselves in runaway climate change. We do not have that much long left to really get ahead of this, and we need to stop looking at the world in terms of, oh, well, this is a democracy and this is an authoritarian government. We need to move beyond these ideological pitter-patters that we're having, because they're quite irrelevant to the issues that are ahead of us right now. We are dealing with climate change. We're dealing with the potential of artificial superintelligence, which could be a good thing or it could be a massively bad thing. We have to get ahead of this, and that's going to require countries like China, the United States, the UK, Japan, Germany coming together and building bridges with one another and learning from one another, taking notes from one another on where we get things right, where we get things wrong, and help each other out, because that is where we are going to benefit the most, not these boring, pointless debates of which is better, democracy, authoritarian dictatorship. That does not matter right now. We need to become a more multipolar world and unified and operate from that standpoint, or else it doesn't matter whether we're a democracy or not. We're all going to die equally.
Yeah. And also some of these concerns, we're getting into the kind of stuff that's about cyber wars and about very real concerns also about corporate espionage intrigues. That stuff is quite important, but I definitely like to talk about the ways in which markets are going to be disrupted, and new technologies might allow for new kinds of governments and so forth. All of those things, they certainly do tie together. It's always an interesting question. People are saying, is who's the bigger AI player? The UK has an awful lot of tech of this kind. Israel has a lot. Russia has a lot. These are guys that have come up in this course of this conversation. I guess it's easy to just be obsessed with China and the U.S. But there's a lot of good stuff being done, and it's not
Japan.
Japan is much of East Asia is really kind of at the top of everybody's list, whether they're really have that huge market saturation now or not.
Can I just say on the climate change thing to do with China? I mean, that has been on like one of their top security issues for a long time now, because the amount of pollution that they've caused, and it's an outsourcing mechanism. So when all the jobs went from your industrial explosion over there in the US, and then all those factories went to China, I mean, they took all the pollution with them. So and then America, instead of addressing its climate change issues, it got bogged down in a few different wars in the Middle East and expended its resources there instead of the climate. China, it's a systemic issue to do with societal uprising. I mean, the people in Beijing can't breathe. So of course they don't have to find multiple wars in the Middle East. So they have been investing, and I think that's a clever strategy from a societal perspective, from a climate change perspective, and from human health and all the other stuff. But it's because they've stayed out of some of these wars in the Middle East, whether by choice or other, and that's why they have the resources to fight climate change. I think it's good.
Yeah. Well, I mean, China. They certainly have had many issues with climate change. You talked about the smog and how polluted their cities had become. This has actually changed quite significantly over the last few years, where by diminishing their reliance on coal and their huge investment on solar technologies and updated advanced nuclear energy technologies, they've been able to really get ahead of this in many respects, and they're already starting to meet the expectations that the UN have brought forth that they expect for every other country to address their carbon footprint and their input. And they recognize their problems. They've recognized where they were failing the climate and their citizens and their own atmosphere within areas like Beijing and elsewhere, and are trying to get ahead of it. Whereas here in the United States, we still, if you can actually look this up, one of the biggest contributors to climate change right now is the U.S. military in and of itself, because of how much the transports of our troops, the way that we've got them stationed all across the world, and the amount of reliance on oil and fossil fuels that help generate this huge military industrial might that we have. This is a big problem to where we're going to have to start moving away from this idea that we're this warlike military type nation that is at war with everybody, and start building bridges. We need to bring our troops home and start utilizing them in more beneficial ways, like having them fight climate change, because that is the real war that we're all collectively fighting. Over in China, they had their PLA soldiers, thousands and thousands of them, do this campaign to where they were putting in seeds and increasing forestation throughout their region to help combat climate change. That's something that we could do on the United States' end as well. We could use our military to help in combating climate change. We could help them in combating deforestation. We could use our military to help build the needed infrastructure, a renewable energy infrastructure, a climate neutral infrastructure that is desperately needed in order to exceed the expectations from the UN and the IPCC reports, to ensure that we get ahead of this in dealing with climate change. There are better ways of using the military than we are currently doing, because right now it's the biggest contributor to climate change. That needs to change immediately.
Yeah, it's the biggest contributor to climate change, and it's really the biggest contributor to the U.S.'s race to the bottom. I mean, there's tens of trillions of dollars that have just been lost between the seat cushions. You know, Raytheon at Boeing and Halliburton triple billing everybody.
Better utilization, better way of using our money. We definitely need to refocus how we use our military. And
to me on this show, so what we talk about is the end of the Bretton Woods system. So that's the end of the petrodollar cycle. So we're shifting out of these fossil fuels into new forms of energy. Where it's the end of this sort of policing of the world structure. But that will leave the world in an anarchic state, as these smaller states, which have been held back by the U.S. military from fighting each other under a forced sort of WTO regime where it's trade for trade's sake. As the U.S. withdraws, you're going to leave a lot of countries exposed to a lot of fighting. And I think it could end up in a period, I don't know how long, post Bretton Woods, of a global anarchy, and that'll be a consequence of the U.S. withdrawing all over the world. But I mean, if that's got to happen, I mean that's got to happen. If they could somehow, I don't know how you're going to address that, but it's what people want in the United States. Trump got elected on the back of whether people like it or not, on U.S. withdrawal, not the Ron Paulian. He wasn't right time, but U.S. withdrawal. Let's get out of all. Let's pull our troops home and isolate ourselves on this big upper island in the middle of nowhere in the United States, this northern hemispheric island that you guys are living on.
Well, to be fair, I'm not advocating for isolationism. I'm not advocating for us to simply abandon other countries or abandon any.
Ben, are you still there?
I am still here, yes.
Okay, so we've lost. What about you? What do you think?
Right. Well, I would say of this concern that, I also agree that the isolationism is not the thing. There are people, we would say maybe more economists of a more anarcho-capitalist bent, who are, or people in the Trump administration for that matter, key advisors and architects of this campaign who I've mentioned before. I think people like Peter Thiel, who would say just, let's have that economic isolationism. Let's have that let the chips fall where they may attitude, and let the emerging digital infrastructure kind of hopefully fill in the gaps. But that's a pretty reckless attitude.
It is.
And we had this exact same conversation in another context the last time we spoke, with talking about how we can't just entirely deregulate some agency, which would lead to diminishing quality of life of tens of millions of people. And this kind of economic isolationism has those prospects as well.
BJ,
So
Did I cut off?
yeah, your internet went out. You were talking about isolationism and how you didn't agree with it.
Well, I was saying that I'm not advocating isolationism. I'm simply advocating that we move our military away from these countries, because we need to abandon the war ventures and start considering more peaceful relations, more beneficial trade relations with these countries. It's not about leaving them in a state of anarchy, because we can address their issues in the same way that we address our own issues. How do we ensure that we don't have an anarchic system? Not anarchist in the sense of like what Noam Chomsky talks about, but more like Southern Sudan or something like that. We're talking about the way that we address and ensure that we don't become an anarchist type society is by making sure that people have the infrastructure needed to survive. People have the basic needs to survive. People have the health care and have proper food on their table and what have you. And we can help another nation, and other nations can help each other address these issues from a non-military standpoint just as effectively through better trade relations, through better, more peaceful relations. And we see this like with China and Africa. They have an enormous peaceful relationship in terms of trade and infrastructure and what have you from a non-military standpoint, and they both benefit each other. And that's something that we could do from a non-military standpoint. The point is to get the military out and stop being contributors to climate change and start being the ones that are really at the forefront and are fighting climate change, while from a governance standpoint, we are reaching out to other countries and trying to help them just as they are trying to help us, and make sure that it doesn't become this sort of global anarchic cataclysm.
Ben, I had Rachel Haywire on the show, and I asked her if I put her in a scenario. She's the president of the United States. There's some countries, two ethnic groups or two countries that are starting to fight each other and or genocide each other. Would she step in? She said no. She said basically no, that that she wouldn't really want to do that because we need to look after Americans first. I put her in the situation of the white genocide going on in South Africa. What do you think about that? I mean, is it America's responsibility to police the world, or are you just America first, withdraw and allow the Hutsis and the Tutsis to go for it?
Okay, yeah. There's no. I am basically for a significant diminishment, as she is, of the role of the military-industrial complex. So that would not allow for the continued sustaining of 6,000 military bases. That would not allow for the continued sustaining of trillions of dollars in Pentagon bloat and lost revenue for the public trust that we could be using for good things instead of for things that almost always just backfire and blow up in our face. So yeah, but there is a role there, I suppose. What you say about the U.S. on the world stage is not. It's not. I don't disagree with it. I just it's not been done in a very good way, and I think there's ways to do it that would cost a lot less in terms of cyber war efforts and similar things that don't just involve what we're talking about. The difference. This is the difference between the U.S. and China is China has this results and productivity oriented a set of regulations and economic expectations. The U.S. has a graft-oriented set of regulations and economic expectations, and that's not suitable. And that's we're covering all of those sins just by saying that the U.S. is a great nation builder or something. And I don't see a lot of great built-up nations in the areas where we're supposedly been building nations. I see wars that have been going on for coming on 2 decades. With people living worse than they were before.
VJ,
Yeah.
we're talking about nation states. What about this accusation that the United Nations is just an arm, a diplomatic arm of the United States? Is that a good thing or a bad thing, or is that it doesn't mean anything? It's not a real statement.
Well, let's just keep in mind that the UN isn't perfect, and I don't think anybody would ever argue that the UN is perfect. It has its own issues, but we should also keep in mind that why the United Nations was formulated to begin with. We saw what happened to the world when we didn't have a unified body of nations coming together and trying to sort things out peacefully. We went through 2 world wars within the course of just a few decades. And so when we started saying that we need to come together, we need to start uniting the nation states to address these issues more effectively and less combatively, that was a benefit to the world, regardless of what one's opinion may be of the UN as a whole and whatever type of issues there may be internally. But and we're already seeing, with in that also applies to like the EU, the European Union, and with the UK trying to pull out of it through the Brexit, and it's already causing a massive chaos in terms of how they're effectively able to get things done. They're still trying to figure out which leader can help them address this situation. They went from Theresa May, and then the considerations of Boris, not Boris, trying to remember his name.
Boris Johnson.
Yeah, Boris Johnson. Yeah. They are currently in a set of where they want to abandon any type of diplomacy or diplomatic relations within the European Union and just go on it themselves. Britain first, it largely derives from Trump's America's first isolationist politics. And quite frankly, isolationism is not going to be to the benefit of anybody. We need to start acting as, akin to like that of the UN, where we have a unified body. There's going to be issues. There's going to be some hiccups, some bumps on the road where we're going to have to significantly address those issues. But in terms of long-term development and peace within these residing regions, the UN has been largely beneficial to ensure that things like what went down in World War I and World War II do not happen again. Because if we have another world war, especially in terms of the technological capacity within our militaries today, this would become a cataclysmic event that we probably wouldn't survive as a species as a whole. So ensuring that that does not occur will require agencies like the UN, and that requires more participation within the countries that are part of the UN.
Then Zion, is the UN just an long arm of US diplomacy, or do you like the UN or what?
Well, I mean, I think probably everyone at this table can imagine the UN taking on different and more robust roles, and some not so US centric roles as well. So I like the UN, but there's a lot of things. There's not a real functioning transnational institution there, in certain respects, and yeah,
Well, I suppose it brings up the question of what is the alternative.
Yeah,
if we
Well,
didn't
there's the
have the UN,
Asia Development
what we
Bank.
have. Right.
There's BRICS. There's EU. There's
Right.
there's the Africa one. Whatever.
Right.
Yeah.
And they all address within their own regions of address certain situations, but it all still sort of goes back to the idea of a unified body of nations to come together, and that concept is something that we should all keep in mind and not revert back to the isolationist perspectives of trying to, America first or Britain first or China first or what have you. Isolationism is not going to bring us the future that we all hope for.
So
I mean,
sorry,
I
Ben.
think,
Yeah.
I think I'd be remiss in mentioning transnational organizations without tying it back to AI and saying that Advanced algorithms and a new class of advanced algorithms could very well create an adhocracy on a transnational level. And, we could very well, one leapfrog scenario that we could reasonably see in some short period of years would be one which a digital democracy is superimposed over the entire world. And that would be something that we would have to have a specific set of protocols that don't quite exist now technologically from the computer science perspective. But there's machines that are pretty close to being able to sustain something like that.
It's so good you mentioned that because a lot of it's funny because a lot of the libertarian community and the anarchist community got on with Bitcoin and blockchain first, but it could be the precursor to the global government. I mean, they've done it. It could be do a switcheroo on them, and suddenly they're beholden to some scary monster that they created, which is a global government context. Plot twist. And it's the libertarian anarchist community through Satoshi that enabled this.
Look, like we could already. It's like a lot of these technologies. We see what's coming, and the concept of a global governance. If we can get past the issue of climate change, global governance is something that will arise in one way or another, because as a species, we're going to have to be able to unite in a more direct way, where we're taking care of each other and making sure that we're all of our well-being is taken care of, and that's going to require a sort of infrastructure of a global governance of some kind.
BJ,
whether it becomes
that I really want to ask you this, because if we're talking about existential crises about AI and climate change and global war, nuclear weapons, whatever, pick your dystopian scenario. Does that mean? Are you saying that these crises jointly will just mold people together despite national boundaries, because it's a species survival as opposed to just a national or an individual survival?
I wouldn't say that it's an inevitable occurrence. I'm saying that those are the possibilities, that global governance, the concept of us uniting together as a world to try and address issues, that is something that if we can get through a lot of these crises that we're dealing with, I believe would become a natural factor that we'll start considering. But whether or not that translates to being a global democracy or a global what have you, will largely rely on how we address these crises that we're currently dealing with right now, and in what way. Do we allow society to just burn, and for the rest of us to sort of keep our distance and try to uplift our own people? Or do we try to bring as many people together? Do we try to reach out and build these bridges with one another, with each nation state, so that we can eventually reach the point where when we start actually having these conversations of should we have a global government, we'll be in a better standpoint to where we can actually effectively discuss these matters. And if we do agree with a global government, we then have a better chance of being able to actually effectively talk to one another from a non-combative, non-military standpoint, and where we're not, where our judgments aren't being predictated by certain crises that we're dealing with, whether it's climate change or artificial superintelligence or what have you.
Ben, same question. Do you see more species-orientated thinking because of the existential crises that we face?
Yeah. To a great degree, I would. I think that empathy can derive from many things. It's a thing in, almost from time immemorial. James has been had these kind of values at heart for quite some time as a religious group. But yeah, I think that the climate crisis does advance many concerns about combating the climate crisis. Does advance many of these kind of core values. I did have one or two other things I wanted to say on the whole.
Yeah.
Well, Yeah, Ray Kurzweil, he talks about sometimes about this. Sometimes he's gone a little bit on the, darker than in recent years, talking comparing the march towards some singularitarian effects and life extension, longevity escape velocity, as something that will itself be rather disruptive. People like to use this analogy of the horse being replaced by the car. It's going to be that simple. The nation state will just be superimposed by this wonderful blockchain single. The reality is there's never been an organizational structure quite as devious as the nation state and dangerous as the nation state. And so sometimes he describes, the events of the European and Asian theater around the Second World War, saying that that's the kind of unrest that we're going to see in the near term as we're building up to some of these things. And we just have to also keep in mind that some of these anarcho-capitalist things have been drivers for this, and some of them might continue to be the best short-term solutions for some of these things. I'm not an out-and-out anarcho-capitalist, but we have to, not by any measure, but we have to kind of. I think a good approach is to have no ideology insofar as it relates to things surrounding advanced algorithms, and hopefully go from there.
Mm-hmm.
Did you have
Yeah, I
anything to
agree.
say?
But
Failing that, definitely anarcho-syndicalist.
Right. Well, I definitely agree that we have, whenever we're addressing these like technological innovations of algorithms and artificial intelligence, ideology should not take precedence. And it's kind of ironic because, as you mentioned, still about how it was through like these libertarian and anarcho-capitalist types that were pushing Bitcoin and the blockchain forward, and they created this thing that could actually bring about a global governance of something that they, from an ideological standpoint, you would think would be very much opposed. And it's kind of like the real world effect of sort of like Frankenstein's monster effect, where they've created this thing that they have clearly had no idea would actually impact in the way that it actually does. Reality tends to be stranger than fiction. But at the same time, while they bring about these technological impact or advancements, there's still going to require certain legislation, certain way we address these technologies and those innovations, certain regulations that will be necessitated to ensure that this product from the mind of a libertarian mindset is still being maintained, as opposed to falling and into this sort of state of destruction that would typically come as a result of nobody really giving it much thought or care and just letting the chips fall where they may.
Yeah, and I think it may be it's worth pointing out that not all of these right libertarians and anarcho-capitalists are people who are heavily influenced by fear-based thinking or socially conservative ideas, and so I've said this a few times on this channel and in other interviews. I do believe that many of the differences between the right libertarian and the left libertarian are features of living in a world of a tremendous scarcity. And a lot of these discussions that we would tend to be having, and hopefully outcomes that we would tend to be seeing, are things that are a little more post-scarcity. And so there's a convergence of those of some of those goals in that framework. And I think we are seeing that in this very same discussion. Ralph Nader's written a pretty good book on this subject, Unstoppable. It's not specific to advanced algorithms and singularitarian issues, but it does describe some of these other kind of convergences ideologically.
Well, it also serves as a testament, really, to what the U.S. Transhumanist Party is trying to achieve, because it definitely hits on the basis of us moving beyond our ideological differences You've described yourself, Ben, as an anarcho-syndicalist. From an ideological standpoint, I would say that I'm more of like a techno-progressive Marxist transhumanist. I don't know what your politics are still. I'm guessing maybe libertarian or what have you.
Yeah. Well, I would just say skeptical of everything.
Right, right. But
A
the point being
skeptic.
that
I'm
regardless, my point is that regardless of what our ideological differences are, the USTP, the United States Transhumanist Party, we're trying to accept as many people into the party as possible, regardless of what you may, how you may view the world from an ideological standpoint, and start considering real world solutions together that go beyond our ideological differences. And if that means we can bring about liberals and conservatives and libertarians and Marxists and anarchists together to consider real world solutions and figure out ways of getting beyond these temper tantrums that we seem to be having within the world of politics, the better off that we would be. And I think that serves as a testament to what the USDP is trying to achieve, and what I would hope that the world will eventually start mirroring themselves.
I love that thought. I think that's a beautiful thought, because that's exactly correct. Although we were bickering before, ultimately it's about this going beyond, and it's about, in America especially, it's about changing the dialogue, changing the conversation up there at the top, changing it away from how many churches can you build per hour to how many ethical regulations can you build per hour, sort of thing. You know what I mean? There's nothing wrong with churches. I'm not having to go at churches, but I mean, you've had 200 years or 400 years to build churches. I mean, isn't it time to do something else? You know what I mean, for a bit. I mean, I'm not having to go to churches, but that's the thing. America's all about freedom. I mean, why, So
the churches should be involved themselves too. We've got plenty of churches. They should be involved too. All the religious committees should be involved within the scientific and technological process. And there are a number of them that are actually getting involved now. We have like the Christian Transhumanist Association, the Mormon Transhumanist Association. We're seeing religious people move beyond that. They still have their belief in God, and that is fine. That is perfectly fine. But they're also recognizing that there are other areas where they could bring about a benefit to humanity as a whole, and bring their perception of heaven on earth. And that requires us coming together and moving beyond religious differences and ideological differences.
And stay tuned on Friday, Saturday your time. We're going to have a religious panel, including a Buddhist, myself, members from the CTA, the MTA, other representatives of other faiths. And we're really excited about that, because you don't have to. These are also not diametrically opposed things in principle. You can have a dedication to scientism and a dedication to a well-run civil society, and still honor your traditions and certain values of this kind.
Yeah, from what I've learned of religion,
some of those things might theoretically enhance excitement around those things. As some sort of positive utopian millennialist or utopian paradise notions. Millennialist is confusing. Those things could be themselves organizing principles by which a civilization adopts a quicker rate of techno progress. I like the CTA and the MTA for that. The MTA is a lot of smart guys.
Yeah, and from what I've learned of religion, I mean, and no one can dispute this, not Christians, not Buddhists, not Islamists, and nobody can dispute this, is that religion is open to interpretation, both within their own theocracy and religious beliefs, and personally, because like when I look around at all the different religions, they're all divided on every single issue, and it's not like there's some big massive flow, unless you're in a very, very, very small religion. But at least the major faiths, they're all quite divided. They'll have different ideas about sexuality, different ideas about how many times you should go to church a week. Some say 3, sometimes 1. Some says once once saved, always saved. Other people say, no, you got to save yourself every morning. You know, pray 1 time a year, pray 5 times a year. So these churches, regardless of what people say, and they say, I have the absolute authority to say that my interpretation and my little church interpretation is absolutely correct. I mean, even on a national stage, you look at big people like George Bush to Obama to Trump. I mean, they're all arguing about different religious ideas. I mean, religion is open into interpretation, and you know, we're talking about the United Nations before. If anything, it's a good forum for different nation states and different religions and different people to sit down in a forum context in a room and actually just have these conversations outright. You know, and so in that way, it's got running water, you know, it's got a roof. You know, there's some seats. You know,
it's. I think it's important to be able to say that, you know, we are a lot of these institutions are kind of post-religious. You know, outside of the U.S., a lot of Christians would be described as kind of post-Christians. You could say the same thing of world Jewry, and to a lesser extent of some other faiths. But you know, if you look at an ultra-Orthodox Jew, you look at a Christian fundamentalist in the United States. That's, you know, 12-15% of people would be hardline conservative Christian fundamentalists. And you look at an awful lot of Muslims, and you say, if you ask those 3 guys, what is your opinion on abortion, or what is your opinion on your daughter having sex, or some other kind of social conservative hot button issue, and then you go to guys down the line from those 3, a reform or ordinary Orthodox Jew, a Christian of a different kind in the United States or the world around, a more liberal-minded Muslim, and you say, what is your opinion on those things? And all of those guys who are ostensibly from 3 different faiths have more in common with one another than they do have with their so-called religious moderate cohorts, or rather their religious moderate sort of team members. So, I mean, this is really a feature of a kind of entrenched social conservatism, and also it's a feature of that sort of weaseliness of religious literalism, where you can kind of just affirm any kind of hateful thing that you care to indulge.
It should also be mentioned that even if there were certain religious types, or hell, even maybe even non-religious types that do not particularly agree with the transhumanist mindset that we're sort of talking about in the future that we're trying to build, that does not necessarily mean there has to be a combative relationship between those who choose to not enhance themselves, those that choose to not embrace this transhumanist feature, and those of us that do choose to embrace it. We already have like a peaceful relationship here in the United States between our overwhelmingly technological society and the societies like those of the Amish. We're not at war with the Amish. They live their own lives peacefully. They have, which isn't to say that they don't embrace technologies. They have like a committee, some sort of committee, to where they come together as a community and determine which technology comes into their society, which does not, and so on and so forth. Which, by the way, I thought was quite hilarious.
GMOs.
That, yeah, a few years ago they embraced GMOs. As soon as the Amish embraced GMOs, I think the debate's over. Let's be real there.
Yeah. But I mean, it's
but we have a peaceful relationship with them. They choose to not be as technologically advanced as us, and we choose to be more technologically advanced, but we're not at war with one another. We're not going at each other's throats. We're not being vicious with one another. And that should also apply to when we reach a transhumanist future, where we have people like a neo-Amish or these cis humanity, or what have you, whatever you want to call it. You know, people that choose to not take that leap into a technological transformation. We can still have a peaceful relationship with them. It's just being considerate and being understanding of where the boundaries are, where they wish to stand, and where we wish to stand.
Yeah. And, you know, this kind of conversation does come up a lot when talking about these things, because for better or worse, the transhumanist organizations and this political party we're kind of paranoid conspiracy theory adjacent. We're kind of science fiction fanatic adjacent. And so people are often talking about these things. You know, Christian scientists, for example, they want to practice their faith, which does not include a radical life extension. To those things would kind of be diametrically opposed. But they don't necessarily. Those practitioners don't necessarily view transhumanists as their enemy. But paranoid weirdos want to kind of set that up as, you know, the transhumanists are going to force everybody to bend to their will. That's not really in the spirit of anything that I'm too familiar with in this community. There's not that foisting on others of these things. People want to live a little bit longer. They can. If they want to live a lot longer, they can. If they want to be experiencing substantively different lifestyles like that of a Neuralace, they can. If they want to really avoid all of that, they can as well. There's room for everybody on this earth.
You know, it's funny. It's a good conversation because, you know, like Christians have expanded their lifespans to 80 years and they haven't blinked. They didn't worry about it. Nazi Germany, for example, was Christian and they were trying to improve human stock to basically live forever, and they didn't worry about it. You know, so Christians and life extension, they've never really worried about it. They've never really cared about it. And the other thing is, like, the fundamentalists, like Pastor Anderson and others, you know, they say they don't care. They just say God's got it all planned out anyway. So if you want to do it, have a go, but he's going to kill you when you hit that 120 mark anyway, or he's going to take your soul out if you cryogenically freeze you, or God will step in before the AI is released onto humanity. So please, go ahead. I'm just going to keep preaching my fundamentalist idea, and God's going to step in and damn you people who think that you're higher and more mighty than him. So please go ahead. I mean, so a lot of these fundamentalists don't really care, because to them, life is a sort of linear process. It's already been planned, and God's got punishment and or everything worked out, and it's all baked into the cake.
And when Judgment Day doesn't come, you know.
Yeah, well, I mean,
we continue forward. It's like the Y2K, the 2012. You know, there were fundamentalists within all that nonsense, and when it came to the day that things were supposed to go already, and it didn't happen, we continued moving forward. And the fundamentalists, you know, they're always going to try to have their say, and we're just going to have to try to ignore it and continue building better relationships with those that will hear us out and those that are willing to work with us.
Yeah, and in the same breath that we would say that you know, there's enough room in the world for everyone to honor their cultures and values, I think we should also say just as stridently that every religious literalist is effectively a latent theocrat. And if you get these people together and let them start to run your country as they do in the United States, it's a small percentage of people, but all those tens of thousands of trusted Beltway insiders rather, and Houston power brokers, and all of those guys are Christo-fascist pigs that want to bring around the end of the world. And that's a kind of predictable trajectory when you have religious literalism and you don't have firm barriers between church and state.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, church to say. Oh, we'll wrap it up because we probably could go. I don't know what the time is there, but like we'll wrap it up and we'll continue this conversation when it's not so late for you guys, because we're having a really good discussion, and I reckon we could do a lot more. But I don't want to push it too far because I don't know what the time is. But
it's midnight.
Yeah, it's midnight. Oh, that's not too bad then. But yeah. But we'll leave.
Let's do this again with a bigger panel.
With a better panel, because these are really, really good topics all over. Like, especially, I love having an ethicist in the room because, you know, it just brings that other, you know, that humanly perspective that I've been looking for, not just a policy perspective, you know, based on, based on values and based on, you know, common sense in a way too. So, BJ, is there anything you'd like to say to wrap up? I mean, so many points. Everything from human-monkey hybrids all the way through to AI, through to religious literalism. Anything you want to say in closing statements? You can go for your life.
Well, Well, with everything that we sort of talked about, I always try to bring it back to the singular point that as a world, we need to start coming together. We need to start building more bridges, less number of walls. We need to start embracing this idea of being a unified species as opposed to an isolationist ideology where we're trying to move away from each other and away from each other's problems. Because the more people that we have involved, the more people that come together, the better off we're going to be. That comes from a political standpoint, scientific, technological, what have you. We need more people involved, whether you're religious, regardless of what your ideology is. We have the means to build a better world, to bring heaven on earth, but it's going to require all of our participation. And if we can do that, we'll be able to address any obstacle that comes our way, whether it's climate change, AI, what have you.
Ben, closing comments, closing thoughts, anything you want to say, plug, etc.?
Sure. Yes. Well, I mean, just technology is an all-encompassing subject, and advanced algorithms and its applications bleeds into every discipline. So I don't feel too bad that we had a pretty broad-ranging discussion and kind of getting into domestic policy and foreign policy issues that weren't directly deriving from concerns about AI. But the Futurist New Deal was conceived of to advance not just public health outcomes and lifestyle outcomes in the U.S., but also to allow for a climate that would be making the best use of these advanced algorithms. And you know, the main points of the Futurist New Deal are quite simple. We want to have enhanced e-governance and voting allowed for in every state. It's not really something that's allowed for except in the sparest of pilot programs today. We want to, of course, have this middle-class basic income for every adult. The cost is not significant compared to the great benefits because we have the means of funding this through the federal land dividend, and the value of Ben Goertzel's new sphere comes into focus in that discussion, because you see a country that has a reasonably high level of education, that has a reasonably high level of literacy in these specific arenas, then having the ability to make the best use of this human capital, which honestly, it's 100+ million people where it's just going to waste. All of those people who say that their work is effectively make work, all of those people who say that if they were able to start their own business, be making an app, be doing this or that, they would. That's a better kind of economy. Andrew Yang's sort of a real economy encompasses some other areas beyond that. And you know, we just have to be doing those basics, like weakening the prison industrial complex, dramatically weakening that, and the military industrial complex, changing entirely the face of those, and of course providing a public health service of the kind that would allow not only for people to be having their basic needs met, but ultimately be setting the stage for a radical life extension.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for coming on, and BJ, I thank you so much for coming on. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks again to Ben Zion for setting everything up. Absolute, wonderful work with you on this. Even though this is part of your candidate campaign.
Thank you so much, BJ. I've been an admirer of your writing for a long time. It's an honor to sit down with you, sir.
Likewise, and I'm looking forward to see how far this election goes, and see how far you go.
Thank you, sir. And if we have another kind of, some these AI guys a little better than I do. Like, I sort of know Ben Goertzel, I sort of know Josiah Zahner, but if you want to do another one of these panels, or even just you and them, it would be awesome just to see it. It would be awesome to have any part in it.
Yeah, yes, please. And I'm not Ben Goertzel bashing, by the way. I respect the man. I have high respect for him. I'm just simply trying to talk about it and have debate and be fair. I don't want to just suck up to
Well,
random people.
we can get Ben Wirtz on here. He's always fun, regardless of what people's opinions may be of him, or whether you like him or hate him. He's always a fun person to really
To me,
sit down and talk.
To me, he looks like a man who would respect robust debate. You see, and that's
Oh yeah, yeah, and that's always fun. That's always willing for a good time.
All right, well, that's fantastic. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for coming on Detonation, everybody. And all more coming all this week, and we'll try and we'll religious panel is going to be huge. Ben, you excited?
Yep. Yeah, I'm excited about that. I hope people will check that out.
Absolutely.
That's Friday at 6 p.m. Pacific, at 9 Eastern. And we got a great group on there. I'm going to be heading then out of town for a day and a half, almost immediately after that. But I'm looking forward to that. We got everybody lined up, and that's going to be a great show. So check it out.
All right, fantastic. All right, thanks everybody for coming on Detonation.
All right.